You know what's funny? People can watch you struggle for years and still convince themselves they understand your limits. They see the mistakes, the setbacks, the moments when you had nothing to say, and they quietly decide that's all they've got. And you let them believe it. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't proving someone wrong with an argument. It's disappearing into the work. No announcements, no desperate explanations, no begging anyone to believe in you. Just discipline, patience, and that strange little fire inside you that refuses to die. They thought your silence meant weakness. They thought your failure was the final chapter. They thought you were finished because you stopped trying to convince them otherwise. But you weren't finished. You were learning. You were observing. You were rebuilding yourself where nobody could see. And then one day you did the one thing they never expected. You became the evidence. Not louder, not desperate, not obsessed with revenge. Just better. So much better that their old opinion of you suddenly became irrelevant. The person they underestimated started making decisions they couldn't understand. The person they laughed at started moving with a level of confidence that didn't need permission. And the beautiful part is, you didn't have to destroy them. You simply outgrew the version of yourself they thought would never change. That is what pure genius looks like sometimes. Not intelligence screaming for attention, but intelligence knowing exactly when to stay quiet, when to learn, when to wait, and when to make one move that changes the entire conversation. People have a strange habit of measuring your future using your past. They look at where you are standing today and suddenly think they know where you are going tomorrow. They remember the mistake you made, the opportunity you lost, the moment you stayed quiet, the time you failed, and they build an entire identity around it. Funny, isn't it? They don't need to know your potential. They only need to see your current position. If you're struggling, they assume you're weak. If you're quiet, they assume you're afraid. If you're starting over, they assume you already lost. They judge the unfinished version of you as if it were the final product. And maybe you believed them for a while. Maybe their opinions got inside your head, because when enough people repeat the same thing, even a strong mind can start questioning itself. You begin looking at your own reflection through their eyes. You stop asking what you can become and start asking whether they were right about what you can't become. That's the trap, not failure, not rejection. The trap is allowing someone else's limited imagination to become the ceiling of your life. They saw the chapter where you were confused. They didn't see the chapter where you were learning. They saw you fall behind. They didn't see the nights you spent trying to understand what went wrong. They saw your silence and called it weakness, without realizing silence can be the place where a person becomes dangerous to every expectation placed on them. Because when you stop wasting energy explaining yourself, you suddenly have energy left for something much more useful. Building, learning, improving, becoming. You don't need to announce that you're changing. In fact, announcing every move can become another form of distraction. You start performing progress instead of creating it. You tell people what you're going to do. They give you attention. You feel temporarily successful, and suddenly the desire to actually do the work becomes weaker. So you stop talking, not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally understand that results speak a language excuses never could. Let them misunderstand you. Let them underestimate you. Let them think you're still the same person they remember. There is something powerful about being underestimated when you are no longer trying to impress anyone. You can work without applause. You can make mistakes without an audience. You can rebuild without constantly checking whether people approve of the process. And slowly something changes. The person who once needed validation begins trusting their own judgment. The person who once needed permission starts making decisions. The person who once feared being laughed at becomes comfortable being misunderstood. That is when potential begins turning into ability. Potential means nothing if you never develop it. You can have intelligence, creativity, talent, ambition, and instinct, but none of it matters if you refuse to train it. The people who judged you may have been looking at raw material and assuming it was worthless because it wasn't polished yet. They didn't understand that some of the strongest things in life look unimpressive before they are refined. A seed doesn't look like a forest. A blank page doesn't look like a masterpiece. A beginner doesn't look like an expert. And you didn't look like the person you were becoming. That's what they missed. They judged the visible version of you while the invisible version was under construction. Every mistake was teaching you something. Every rejection was forcing you to become more precise. Every embarrassing moment was showing you where you needed to grow. Every setback was removing an illusion about yourself. You were collecting information while they were collecting opinions. And opinions are cheap. Anyone can have one. Anyone can tell you that you won't make it. Anyone can point at your history and predict your future. Anyone can laugh when you're struggling. Anyone can disappear when things become difficult. But very few people have the patience to watch someone rebuild themselves from the inside. So stop trying to convince people who have already decided who you are. You cannot force someone to see your potential. You cannot argue someone into believing in you. You cannot explain your future to someone who only understands your past. And you certainly don't need to chase people around demanding that they recognize your worth. Build anyway. Improve anyway. Keep going anyway. Because one of the most satisfying moments in life isn't hearing someone say, "I was wrong." It's realizing you no longer care whether they admit it. Their approval loses its value when you finally develop your own standards. Their doubt becomes background noise when your discipline becomes louder. Their old opinion becomes irrelevant when your new reality becomes undeniable. And maybe that's the real genius behind proving people wrong. You don't spend your life trying to defeat their opinion. You simply become so committed to your growth that their opinion no longer controls your direction. You take the doubt, the criticism, the rejection, the laughter, the assumptions, and you turn all of it into information. Not anger, not obsession. Information you learn. You adapt. You sharpen yourself. You become harder to distract because you finally understand what matters. And while they are still remembering who you used to be, you are already becoming someone they never had the imagination to predict. There comes a point when you realize that explaining yourself is exhausting, especially to people who have already decided what they want to believe about you. You explain your choices, they question your intentions. You defend your progress, they search for another reason to doubt it. You tell them what you're building, they tell you why it won't work. You reveal your plans, and suddenly everyone has an opinion about a future they are not even living. Strange, isn't it? People can know almost nothing about your journey and still feel completely qualified to judge the destination. So you stopped explaining. Not because you became cold. Not because you suddenly stopped caring. You simply discovered something more valuable than being understood, moving without needing permission. Silence became your strategy. You stopped announcing every goal. You stopped telling everyone what you were planning. You stopped giving people a front row seat to every struggle, every setback, every uncertain decision. You realized that not everything needs an audience. Some transformations need privacy because too many voices can turn a simple decision into a complicated one. When you talk too much about what you're going to do, you create opportunities for people to interfere before you even begin. One person questions you, another laughs. Someone else gives advice you never asked for. Suddenly, your original idea is buried beneath 10 different opinions. And if you're not careful, you start living according to the expectations of people who aren't carrying the consequences of your decisions. So you became quiet, and something unexpected happened. You started hearing yourself again. Without all the noise, you could finally recognize what you actually wanted. Not what looked impressive. Not what would make people jealous. Not what would earn applause. What actually mattered to you. Silence gave you room to think before reacting. It gave you time to observe before speaking. It gave you the ability to notice patterns that emotional people often miss. You began watching instead of responding. You noticed who supported you when there was nothing to gain. You noticed who only appeared when you were successful. You noticed who encouraged your growth and who became uncomfortable whenever you change. You noticed how quickly some people judged a decision they didn't understand, and you stopped arguing with them. That was the upgrade. You realized that not every misunderstanding deserves a correction. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every insult deserves a response. Sometimes the strongest answer is simply refusing to participate in the conversation. People expect reactions because reactions give them access to you. If they can provoke you, they can control your attention. If they can make you angry, they can influence your mood. If they can make you desperate to prove yourself, they can keep you running in circles while they stand still and watch. But silence changes the game. When you stop reacting to everything, people lose the ability to predict you through emotion. You become calmer, more deliberate, more difficult to manipulate. You don't need to respond immediately because you're no longer trying to win every little battle. You start choosing your battles. That is where your power grows. You begin understanding that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is restraint. Sometimes it is discipline. Sometimes it is confidence without performance. A person who constantly needs to prove their strength is often still searching for validation. But someone who knows what they are capable of can afford to let people misunderstand them. Let them think you're doing nothing. Let them assume you've given up. Let them believe you're still stuck where they last saw you. You don't have to correct the story. You have work to do. Because while people are talking about what you should have done, you can be preparing what you will do next. While they are discussing your past, you can be improving your future. While they are waiting for you to react, you can be building something that requires your full attention. There is a certain freedom in becoming invisible to unnecessary opinions. You stop checking who noticed. You stop wondering who approved. You stop measuring your progress against someone else's reaction. And suddenly your motivation becomes cleaner. You're no longer working because you want to prove them wrong. You're working because you refuse to remain the same person. You're no longer training because you want applause. You're training because you understand what discipline can create. You're no longer chasing success to make people regret underestimating you. You're chasing mastery. That difference changes everything. Because revenge still gives your enemy control. If your entire motivation is proving someone wrong, they are still living inside your head rent-free. Every achievement becomes a message to them. Every victory becomes an attempt to get their attention. But real growth happens when you stop making your life a response to somebody else. You become your own reason. Your silence becomes cleaner. Your decisions become sharper. Your energy becomes focused. And the people who expected you to explain yourself begin noticing something uncomfortable. You are no longer asking to be understood. You are simply moving, no announcement, no dramatic speech, no desperate attempt to convince anyone. Just quiet work, repeated discipline, deliberate choices, and a mind that has finally learned that not every thought needs to be spoken, and not every move needs to be revealed. Doubt has a funny way of disguising itself as truth when you hear it often enough. Someone tells you that you're not capable, and at first you laugh. Then someone else says the same thing. Then another person reminds you of your past mistakes. Eventually, the noise becomes so familiar that you start hearing it in your own voice. That is when doubt becomes dangerous. Not when someone else says it, but when you begin repeating it to yourself. But you reached a point where something changed. Instead of allowing their doubt to become your identity, you turned it into fuel. You stopped asking, "What if they're right?" and started asking a much more interesting question. What happens if I become everything they said I couldn't be? That question can change a life, because you don't always need encouragement to become disciplined. Sometimes disappointment is enough. Sometimes rejection is enough. Sometimes being underestimated is enough. When people expect nothing from you, you have two choices. You can accept their prediction, or you can quietly build evidence against it. You chose the second one. You stopped looking for motivation every morning. Motivation is unreliable. It appears when you feel inspired and disappears when things become uncomfortable. Discipline is different. Discipline doesn't care how you feel. It shows up when you're tired. It works when nobody is watching. It continues when the excitement disappears. And that's exactly why doubt became useful. Every time someone underestimated you, you remembered the feeling. Not so you could become obsessed with them, but so you could remember why you refused to stay the same. Their words became a reminder that your current situation was not permanent. Their judgment became another reason to keep sharpening yourself. You began creating routines instead of excuses. You started doing the boring things. You repeated the fundamentals. You worked when nobody cared. You improved when nobody noticed. You kept going when there was no immediate reward. And slowly something strange happened. The person who once needed external motivation started becoming self-driven. You didn't need someone to tell you that you were capable anymore, because you had started collecting proof from your own actions. One completed task, one difficult decision, one uncomfortable conversation, 1 hour of focused work, one promise kept to yourself, then another, then another. That is how confidence is actually built. Not through positive words alone, but through evidence. Every time you do what you said you would do, you teach your brain that your word means something. Every time you keep moving when you want to quit, you strengthen your ability to tolerate discomfort. Every time you choose the long-term reward over the short-term pleasure, you become more difficult to control. And suddenly, their doubt doesn't feel as powerful anymore. Because you have something stronger than their opinion. You have evidence. They may still remember the old version of you. They may still talk about your mistakes. They may still believe you are incapable of changing. Fine. Let them keep that version. You don't need to drag them into your transformation. You have work to do. There is no need to announce every improvement. In fact, announcing it can sometimes weaken the process. You don't need applause for waking up early. You don't need recognition for staying disciplined. You don't need someone congratulating you for refusing an old habit. Some of the most important victories in your life will happen in moments nobody sees. That is where character is built, when you could react but choose restraint, when you could quit but continue, when you could waste an hour but protect it, when you could chase attention but return to the mission. That is discipline, not some dramatic personality transformation, not becoming emotionless, not pretending you never struggle. Real discipline means you struggle and still make the decision that serves your future, and your future deserves more loyalty than your temporary feelings. Think about how powerful that becomes over time. A person who once doubted themselves starts trusting themselves. A person who once needed approval becomes comfortable walking alone. A person who once feared failure starts treating failure like information. That is when the game changes. You stop seeing obstacles as insults. You stop seeing criticism as a personal attack. You start asking what can be learned. You become curious instead of defensive. You become strategic instead of emotional. Someone says you can't do it. You don't argue. You train. Someone laughs at your goal. You don't explain, you work. Someone expects you to fail again. You don't panic, you prepare. That calmness becomes its own kind of power. Because people can argue with your words, but they can't argue with consistent results. They can question your intentions, but they can't erase your progress. They can remember who you used to be, but they cannot stop you from becoming someone new. And the best part is that eventually, you realize you were never really building yourself for them. They were just the noise that woke you up. The doubt was never the destination. It was the spark. You took every careless judgment, every low expectation, every moment of being underestimated, and transformed it into another reason to become more disciplined, more focused, more patient, more deliberate, until the person they doubted became the person who no longer needed their belief. There is something almost amusing about the way people predict your future based on the version of you they already know. They remember your old habits, your old mistakes, your old reactions, and then they assume they have your entire story figured out. They think they know what you will do next because they have seen what you did before. But people forget one important detail. You are allowed to change the pattern, and that is exactly what they never saw coming. They expected you to stay predictable. They expected the same excuses, the same reactions, the same weaknesses, the same emotional decisions. They became comfortable with the version of you that they could understand. They knew what would make you angry. They knew what would distract you. They knew what would make you seek approval. They knew which buttons to push because you kept giving them access to the same old version of yourself. Then you stopped playing. Not dramatically, not loudly. You simply changed. You stopped reacting to every little thing. You stopped chasing people who were pulling away. You stopped explaining every decision. You stopped allowing temporary emotions to make permanent choices. You started thinking before responding, observing before judging, and planning before moving. To them, it probably looked strange. To you, it was growth. Growth is uncomfortable because it often looks like loss before it looks like progress. You lose habits that once made you comfortable. You lose conversations that once consumed your time. You lose the need to be constantly understood. You lose the desire to prove yourself to people who never bothered to understand you in the first place. And suddenly, your life becomes quieter. But quieter doesn't mean emptier. Sometimes quiet means focused. You started protecting your attention like it mattered. Because eventually you realized that attention is one of the most expensive things you own. Every argument costs attention. Every unnecessary comparison costs attention. Every pointless conversation costs attention. Every hour spent trying to convince someone of your worth is an hour you could have spent developing it. So you started choosing carefully where your energy goes, who gets access to your mind, which problems deserve your attention, which opinions deserve your consideration. That was the move, not some genius trick, not some dramatic revenge plan. Growth, simple, uncomfortable, relentless growth. And the funny thing about growth is that it makes your old enemies confused without you ever trying to confuse them. The person they could provoke becomes calm. The person who used to chase approval becomes independent. The person who used to react immediately starts taking their time. The person who once needed everyone around them suddenly becomes comfortable standing alone. They might wonder what happened. Nothing happened overnight. You just stopped betraying yourself. Every small decision added up. You chose discipline over comfort. You chose patience over impulse. You chose long-term progress over immediate validation. You stopped feeding habits that were keeping you trapped. One decision didn't transform you. Thousands of small decisions did. That is why people often underestimate growth. They look for a dramatic moment, but real transformation usually happens quietly. It happens when you decide to wake up and do the work even though nobody is watching. It happens when you refuse to return to an old habit, even though it would be easier. It happens when you walk away from an argument instead of needing the final word. Nobody applauds those moments. Nobody sees them. But they change you. And eventually, the outside world begins noticing what happened on the inside. Your posture changes. Your decisions change. Your standards change. Your reactions change, your priorities change. You become less impressed by attention and more impressed by consistency. You become less interested in appearing successful and more interested in actually becoming capable. You stop asking, how do I make them respect me? And start asking, how do I respect myself more tomorrow than I do today? That question changes everything. Because when your focus shifts from perception to development, you become difficult to manipulate. Compliments don't control you. Criticism doesn't destroy you. Rejection doesn't define you. Success doesn't make you careless. You begin seeing everything as information. Praise can teach you what works. Criticism can show you what needs improvement. Failure can expose weak points. Success can reveal what deserves repetition. And suddenly, even the things meant to break you become part of your education. That is when your growth becomes the move nobody saw coming. They were waiting for you to argue. You improved. They expected you to react. You observed. They expected you to quit. You continued. They expected you to remain predictable. You evolved. And there is something almost unsettling about watching someone become unfamiliar without becoming fake. You didn't become someone else. You became more disciplined versions of yourself. You didn't lose your personality. You lost the habits that were controlling it. You didn't become emotionless. You became better at deciding which emotions deserved the steering wheel. That is maturity with teeth. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to post about it. You don't need to tell everyone that you are changing. Let the results introduce the new version. Because eventually, The people who knew your old patterns will notice that their old methods no longer work. The same words don't trigger you. The same distractions don't control you. The same temptations don't pull you backward. The same criticism doesn't make you question yourself, and they may never understand exactly when it happened. That's fine. They weren't supposed to see the construction. They were only going to see the finished structure. There is a moment when you get tired of explaining who you are to people who have already decided who you should be. You explain your intentions, they question them. You describe your goals, they laugh at them. You show them progress, they find something wrong with it. And after a while, you realize something almost ridiculous. You have been spending more energy convincing people of your potential than actually developing it. So you stop. You stop defending every decision. You stop chasing every misunderstanding. You stop trying to make everyone clap for a version of you that is still under construction. And that is when something changes. You stop proving yourself and start becoming proof. Because words are easy. Anyone can say they are disciplined. Anyone can say they are focused. Anyone can say they are going to change their life. Anyone can make promises when everything feels exciting. But eventually, words become cheap when actions refuse to follow them. The world doesn't need another announcement about what you are going to become. It needs evidence. So you start giving it, quietly. You wake up and do what you said you would do. You keep promises that nobody else knows you made. You work when there is no applause. You continue when motivation disappears. You choose the difficult option even when the easy one is sitting right there, smiling at you like a bad decision wearing expensive clothes. And slowly, your behavior begins telling a different story. You don't have to say you are disciplined because your routine says it. You don't have to say you are focused because your attention proves it. You don't have to say you have changed because your reactions reveal it. You don't have to tell people you are becoming stronger because the things that once controlled you no longer have the same power. That is real proof. Not noise, not performance. Not some dramatic speech designed to make people regret doubting you. Just evidence accumulated through repetition. And repetition is where transformation becomes dangerous to your old identity. One good day doesn't change everything. One workout doesn't create discipline. One productive morning doesn't make you unstoppable. But doing the right thing repeatedly, especially when you don't feel like doing it, starts creating a version of you that even your old habits struggle to recognize. That is the part nobody sees. They see the confidence. They don't see the uncertainty you had to overcome. They see the result. They don't see the boring days that created it. They see the calm. They don't see how many times you had to learn not to react. They see the strength. They don't see the moments when quitting looked incredibly reasonable. People love the final scene. They rarely care about the construction. But you know what it cost. You know how many times you had to choose yourself when nobody else was choosing you. You know how many distractions you had to remove. You know how many old habits tried to pull you backward. You know how many times you had to remind yourself that temporary discomfort was cheaper than permanent regret. And that knowledge gives you something no compliment can provide. Self-trust. You begin trusting yourself because you have evidence that you can rely on yourself. That changes your entire relationship with failure. You stop seeing failure as proof that you are incapable. You start seeing it as information. You make an adjustment, you try again, you learn, you continue. That is why proving yourself to others becomes less important over time. You realize that their approval can disappear tomorrow. Their attention can disappear tomorrow. Their opinions can change tomorrow. But the relationship you have with yourself follows you everywhere. So you build that relationship carefully. You stop making promises you have no intention of keeping. You stop pretending to be someone you are not. You stop saying yes when you mean no just because you are afraid of disappointing someone. You stop sacrificing your future to protect someone else's temporary opinion of you. And suddenly, you become harder to manipulate, because someone cannot easily convince you that you are weak when you have watched yourself survive difficult seasons. Someone cannot easily convince you that you are incapable when you have repeatedly learned new skills. Someone cannot easily convince you that you are a failure when you understand that failure is part of the process. You don't need to argue. Your life becomes the argument. Your consistency becomes the answer. Your discipline becomes the response. Your growth becomes the evidence. And maybe that is the most satisfying way to prove someone wrong. Not by humiliating them. Not by making them jealous. Not by chasing them around demanding recognition. You simply become undeniable to yourself. Then recognition becomes optional. People can notice or ignore you. They can understand or misunderstand you. They can celebrate you or remain completely silent. It no longer determines your direction, because you have stopped performing for an audience that was never responsible for your future. You are building something much more valuable than an impressive image. You are building character. And character doesn't need to introduce itself. It appears in what you do when nobody is watching. It appears in the decisions you make when there is nothing to gain immediately. It appears in the boundaries you keep when breaking them would be easier. It appears in the discipline you maintain when motivation disappears. It appears in the patience you develop when the results are taking longer than expected. That is when you realize you never needed to prove that you were capable. You needed to become capable. You never needed to prove that you were strong. You needed to become stronger. You never needed to prove that you were different. You needed to live differently. And eventually, the people who once demanded an explanation won't need one anymore, because the evidence will be standing right in front of them, built from every quiet decision you made when nobody was watching, every difficult choice you made when nobody was clapping, and every day you refused to return to the person they thought you would always be. There is a strange kind of victory that nobody can give you because it doesn't come from applause, money, attention, or hearing someone finally admit that they were wrong. It comes from becoming so different from the person you used to be that the old version of you feels almost impossible to recognize. That is the moment you realize the real victory was never about defeating them. It was about defeating the version of yourself that kept believing their limitations. They underestimated you because they judged what they could see. They saw your mistakes, your hesitation, your failures, your quiet moments, your unfinished plans. They looked at a person still learning and assumed they were looking at the final product. And maybe you wanted to correct them. Maybe you wanted to make them regret every word. Maybe you imagined the perfect moment when you would stand in front of them and finally say, "Look at me now." But eventually, something becomes more satisfying than that. You stop caring whether they look. You begin changing for yourself. That is when victory becomes real. Because if your entire transformation depends on making somebody else jealous, impressed, or ashamed, then they still control you. You may have improved your life, but you are still letting their opinion choose your direction. That isn't freedom. That's revenge wearing a nicer outfit. Real victory is quieter. You become disciplined because you respect your future. You become focused because you finally understand how valuable your attention is. You become selective because not everyone deserves access to your energy. You become patient because you stop expecting your life to change overnight. You become mentally stronger because you stop allowing every temporary emotion to dictate your permanent decisions. And the funny thing is, the people who underestimated you may notice the change eventually, but by then, you may not even be interested in their reaction. That is the part nobody expects. They thought your success would be about them. It wasn't. They thought your growth would be a performance. It wasn't. They thought you were climbing just to stand above them. You were climbing because you finally realized how far you could go. That distinction matters. Because when you build your life around comparison, there is always another person to beat. Someone richer, someone smarter, someone faster, someone more successful, someone with more followers, more opportunities, more recognition. You can spend your entire life trying to win a competition nobody officially invited you to. But when you compete with your former self, the game changes. Yesterday becomes the opponent. Your old habits become the challenge. Your old fears become the training ground. Your previous limits become questions instead of conclusions. And every day gives you another chance to become slightly more capable than you were before. That is how you become someone people can't easily underestimate again. Not because you become perfect. You won't. You will still make mistakes. You will still have bad days. You will still lose sometimes. You will still question yourself. But you become harder to break because you know how to recover. You become harder to manipulate because you understand your own values. You become harder to distract because you know what deserves your attention. That is a different kind of strength. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to threaten. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply exists. And eventually, your life starts carrying evidence of the work you did in private. Your decisions become sharper. Your standards become higher. Your circle becomes more intentional. Your habits become more aligned with the person you claim you want to become. People may remember the person you were. You don't have to. You are allowed to outgrow your own history. You are allowed to become unfamiliar to people who only knew your old patterns. You are allowed to stop returning to places, habits, conversations, and identities that no longer fit the person you are building. And some people won't understand. That's fine. Not everyone needs to understand your transformation. Some people only recognize you when you are predictable. When you change, they may call you arrogant. When you set boundaries, they may call you selfish. When you become quiet, they may call you distant. When you stop seeking approval, they may call you different. Of course you're different. That was the point. You weren't supposed to spend your entire life remaining the same just to make everyone else comfortable. You were supposed to grow, and growth sometimes makes old relationships uncomfortable because the rules have changed. The version of you that accepted everything may no longer exist. The version of you that constantly explained yourself may have disappeared. The version of you that tolerated disrespect because you were afraid of losing people may finally understand that losing yourself is far more expensive. That is victory, not revenge, not humiliation, not proving that they were stupid. Just becoming so grounded in who you are that their old judgment cannot pull you backward. And one day, you may look back at the person who once desperately wanted to be understood and realize how much energy they wasted trying to control other people's opinions. You will understand that you never needed to win their approval. You needed to win your own respect. You needed to become someone you could trust. Someone who keeps promises. Someone who learns from mistakes. Someone who can walk away without creating a scene. Someone who can work without applause. Someone who can lose without collapsing. Someone who can succeed without becoming arrogant. Someone who can remain calm when the world expects a reaction. That person is difficult to underestimate because they are no longer dependent on being underestimated or recognized. They have become their own evidence. And that is the final victory, not standing over the people who doubted you, but standing firmly inside the life you built while they were still trying to figure out what you were becoming, with no need for revenge, no need for permission, and no need for anyone to finally understand why you refused to remain the person they thought you were.